27,000 feet above France. German pilot Ralph Hermachen watched strange shapes rising through the sky. Huge, heavy, slow machines. P-47s. He laughed through his oxygen mask, calling them flying milk bottles. Below him, a new kind of war was climbing toward him, silent and ready. Laughter filled the radios. They called the American planes fat targets, clumsy giants with tiny wings. But the truth was hidden under that metal skin. 8 Browning guns, 3,000 rounds, and a heart built for altitude and fire. Soon, the sky itself would remember their sound. Major Don Blakesley led his rookie pilots into their first combat. Engines roared. Hands shook. The P-47 was heavy and strange, but it was strong. Above the clouds, laughing aces waited. Below, the Thunderbolt was about to speak for the first time. They laughed at its shape, at its weight, but in the months ahead, the P-47 would turn mockery into fear. Stay with us, like the video, and discover how 8 guns of steel changed the sky forever. The war of sound and thunder is just beginning. The story began not in glory, but in fear. In 1940, German bombers ruled the European sky, and France was falling. In America, generals watched the newsreels and saw the impossible happening. German fighters flying higher, faster, stronger. They needed something new, something that could fight in the thin air above the clouds. So they called Republic Aviation and said, "Build us a miracle." In a small workshop on Long Island, engineer Alexander Kartveli listened. He was born in Georgia, had seen wars before, and knew what fear felt like. He looked at the specifications and smiled quietly. He would build a fighter so large that pilots would laugh at it, but it would climb to the heavens and breathe where others could not. From panic, the Thunderbolt was born. The first designs looked like dreams from another world, a plane so big it seemed impossible to fly. Even Kartveli called it a dinosaur, but a dinosaur with good proportions. Engineers laughed as they measured the giant engine, the Pratt and Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. It had 18 cylinders and 2,000 horsepower, more than some bombers. People said no pilot could control such a machine. But on May 6, 1941, the prototype rose from the runway. It shook the ground and roared like a storm. The press called it the XP-47B. It was heavy, awkward, and magnificent. At high altitude, where German fighters lost breath, the Thunderbolt was still strong. Its turbo supercharger fed the engine with power from its own exhaust. It did not just fly, it climbed like it was falling upward. Power always has a price. When the P-47 entered training in Connecticut, it terrified its own pilots. Engines twisted the aircraft on takeoff. Landings ended in broken wings and flames. The Thunderbolt killed more Americans in training than Germans ever would in its first months of war. But the men kept learning, and those who mastered it felt unstoppable. Lieutenant Robert Johnson remembered his first flight. "It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive," he said. "You didn't fly it, you aimed it." Every time they fell from the sky, they rose again, stronger. Soon, this dinosaur would meet the wolves of Germany. and the world would see who really ruled the air. Inside the hangars, mechanics worked day and night around the giant engine. The Pratt and Whitney Double Wasp was unlike anything they had ever seen. It filled the front of the aircraft like a heart too big for its chest, a spinning storm of steel and fire. When it started, the walls shook, the floor trembled, and the sound rolled across the airfield like thunder in the mountains. Pilots said you could feel it in your ribs before you heard it in your ears. It was this engine that made the Thunderbolt what it was, a machine that could breathe in the thin air above 27,000 feet, where others gasped and fell. Its turbo supercharger fed the engine's hunger, recycling heat and air until it sang at full power. It was not elegant, not delicate, but it was unstoppable. America had built a flying fortress disguised as a fighter, and soon it would need to prove itself worthy of that roar. By late 1942, the prototype had become a weapon. Factories roared with life across America, women building wings, men testing engines, children watching silver giants take shape in the sky. The Thunderbolt was ready, but the pilots were not. Many still feared its power, its weight, its strange way of flying. Yet war does not wait for comfort. Orders came, and squadrons prepared to cross the Atlantic. As trains carried the new fighters toward ships bound for England, a silent question followed them. Could this machine survive the war? Could it survive even its own strength? On the docks, the air smelled of oil and salt, and crates marked Republic Aviation glowed under the morning sun. Soon, these flying monsters would meet the Luftwaffe over France, and the laughter would begin. But not for long. The thunder was coming. When the first Thunderbolts arrived at the training bases across America, they looked less like airplanes and more like metal monsters. The wings were thick, the nose too heavy, the engine too loud. New pilots stood beside them in silence, unsure whether they were meant to fly these machines or worship them. They had come from light trainers and nimble fighters that danced through the air. The P-47 did not dance. It roared. It could twist left on takeoff, spin on landing, and crush a careless hand. Many young men never made it past their first week. Ground crews watched in fear as smoke and fire rose from broken machines, engines tearing loose, propellers biting into the earth. The Thunderbolt was powerful, but it had no mercy. Major Hubert Zemke watched from the tower, his arms crossed against the wind. He had seen men break before, but never because of a machine. "It's too heavy," the instructors said. "Too dangerous." Zemke only nodded. "Then we'll learn to be heavier and stronger." He turned the airfield into a classroom, one where every crash became a lesson and every survivor became a teacher. The men began to understand the rhythm of the jug, the small corrections, the patience, the trust. When they lifted off and the big radial engine steadied, it felt like taming thunder itself. They were no longer students. They were its chosen few. They called it the Jug, a name that sounded friendly, but every man who flew it knew the truth. It was short for juggernaut, an unstoppable force. When the pilot opened the throttle too fast, the whole aircraft twisted with violent torque. If he pulled too hard during a dive, the wings locked tight, trapping him in a fall that could end in fire. There were days when instructors wept quietly over the wreckage of another lost friend. The Thunderbolt killed the careless and punished the impatient. It demanded respect. And yet, buried inside that danger was a kind of perfection. The same engine that shook the ground would later save countless lives. Its heavy armor that made the landings difficult would one day stop cannon shells. The plane was brutal, but honest. It gave back exactly what a pilot gave to it. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a quiet farm boy from Oklahoma, found himself inside one of those monsters for the first time in early training. The canopy rattled, the seat vibrated, and his heart pounded with fear. Then the engine came alive, and the fear turned to awe. He could feel its power through his bones. Later, he would say, it felt alive, like it wanted to fly, but only with someone it trusted. As weeks passed, stories spread among the airmen, tales of near misses, miraculous recoveries, and the strange bond between man and machine. The Jug didn't forgive mistakes, but it protected those who respected it. In its noise and danger, the pilots discovered discipline and courage. Flying the Thunderbolt became a ritual of trust. Before each takeoff, pilots touched the cold fuselage and whispered something under their breath, a promise or a prayer. They knew the Jug could turn against them in a heartbeat. Its immense power made it rise slowly, until it suddenly pulled them into the sky like a giant lifting a child. During training dives, they discovered something terrifying. The faster it went, the less control they had. Air flowed over the wings until the stick froze, and the ground rushed up faster than their thoughts. The first time it happened, men screamed over the radio. The controls are gone. But then someone learned to ease the power, to pull out gently. And the aircraft answered. The beast had limits, but it could be reasoned with. By early 1943, the Thunderbolt had claimed fewer lives. Pilots now understood how to fly with its rhythm, not against it. They discovered that momentum could be a weapon, that speed could be safety. Instructors no longer feared it. They respected it like a wild animal that finally recognized its rider. Each flight was a dialogue between man and machine, and every victory was mutual. When the pilots crossed the ocean, the laughter of the German aces waited for them. But this time, the Americans would be ready. They were no longer learning to fly. They were learning to survive. By winter of 1942, the Thunderbolt was still feared in the hangars. But slowly, its legend began to change. The men who survived early training were no longer afraid. They were proud. They walked taller, spoke softer, and carried themselves like men who had earned respect from the machine itself. Each flight that ended in one piece felt like a victory. They began to realize that what made the Jug so hard to fly was also what made it unbreakable. Its strong frame, its heavy wings, its thick armor. All of it meant that it could take hits others could not. What had once been a curse was now a shield. Major Hubert Zemke watched his squadrons evolve. He saw fear turn into trust, and trust turn into instinct. The Jug doesn't forgive mistakes, he told them, but it never lies. It was a strange relationship between man and metal, one built on pain, repetition, and faith. They practiced takeoffs until the aircraft stopped fighting back. They dove until they learned to feel the air compress around them. The pilots stopped seeing the Jug as an enemy. They began to see it as an ally. And soon, They would have to take their lessons of steel and fire into real combat. In early 1943, the airfields grew quiet. Rows of Thunderbolts stood ready under gray skies, their wings painted and polished, their engines covered in frost. The men had become a brotherhood, not of rank, but of survival. They packed their gear in silence, knowing they were leaving the safety of training for the chaos of war. Each pilot touched the side of his plane before it was shipped away, a silent promise between man and machine. Across the Atlantic, the Luftwaffe waited, laughing at the stories of these heavy American fighters that could barely climb. Ships groaned under the weight of the crated jugs as they sailed through the winter waves. Inside mess halls, pilots whispered about what awaited them in the skies of France. Men who had been fighting since 1939. Aces who knew every trick in the book. The Americans had never fought a real air battle, but they had something the Germans didn't expect. A beast that could not die easily. The sea carried them forward, toward Europe, toward the baptism of fire that would make the world remember the name Thunderbolt. The first Thunderbolts arrived in England in the cold spring of 1943. Their engines still smelled of salt and ocean wind from the long journey across the Atlantic. Mechanics at the airfields stared in disbelief. The planes looked too big for the runways, too heavy to fly in the narrow skies above Europe. British pilots laughed kindly and called them flying milk bottles. Even the Americans joked about their own machines until they heard them start. The ground shook, and every conversation stopped. In the cockpit, pilots felt the vibration run through their boots, through their hands, into their hearts. The jug did not whisper. It growled. Each takeoff was a challenge, but when it rose, it climbed with a kind of dignity. High above the fields of Kent, the silver wings shone like mirrors catching the sun. This was not a graceful fighter. It was a hammer waiting for an anvil. And across the channel, the anvil was waiting. April 8th, 1943. The cold wind above northern France carried two kinds of sound, laughter and thunder. German pilots from Jagdgeschwader 26 looked down from their Focke-Wulfs and saw something strange. The Americans were climbing toward them in tight formation, their aircraft moving slowly, heavy like steel birds struggling for breath. "Flying milk bottles," one German ace said over the radio. "Big targets." The laughter filled the sky. Below them, 16 Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group fought gravity with every heartbeat. Major Don Blakesley, a former RAF veteran, led from the front. He told his men not to turn, not to climb too fast. "We fight with what we have," he said. "Power and patience." When the German fighters dove, Blakesley pulled his throttle to full and aimed his guns upward. The roar of 8 Brownings broke the silence. The bullets cut the air like lightning. In seconds, the laughter ended, and the war in the air began. The first battle was chaos. Radios screamed with static and fear. "Brake left! Climb! I've got one on me!" The Thunderbolts met the Focke-Wulfs head-on, bullets carving white lines through the sky. German aces expected an easy hunt, but the Americans refused to fall. When one P-47 caught fire, another held its ground. The German cannons punched holes through armor, but the jugs kept flying. The air was filled with smoke, sunlight, and disbelief. Lieutenant Robert Johnson saw tracers flying past his canopy. He turned, too late. Shells exploded against his wings. The cockpit filled with smoke. The canopy jammed. Blood ran down his leg. This is it, he thought. But the engine still growled, even as oil covered the glass. He could not see. Yet the Thunderbolt refused to die. Johnson pointed his nose west, praying for the English coast. Behind him, a German ace fired his last rounds, then flew alongside, staring in disbelief. Johnson's plane was still alive. The pilot gave a small salute and flew away. When Johnson's P-47 landed in England, it was barely more than a skeleton of steel and smoke. Mechanics ran to it, shouting for stretchers, expecting a corpse. Instead, they found the pilot still breathing, and the engine still ticking softly, like a heart that refused to stop. They counted bullet holes until they lost track after 200. Hydraulic lines were cut, armor bent backward, fuel leaking across the runway. Yet somehow, the plane had flown home. The men stared in silence. The impossible had just happened. News of the miracle spread across the bases like fire through dry grass. The P-47, once mocked as a flying cow, was now something else, a survivor. Pilots touched its fuselage as if it were alive. German intelligence refused to believe the reports, but Luftwaffe aces whispered a new word: Thunderbolt. From that moment, the laughter in the skies of Europe began to fade. A new kind of fear took its place, the fear of a machine that could not die. Weeks later, Thunderbolts roared again across the channel. But this time, the German voices on the radio were not laughing. They were warning, shouting, praying. Achtung! Thunderbolts above! The P-47 had earned its name and its legend. German pilots now feared its heavy guns, its impossible dives, its stubborn will to survive. When it appeared in the sun, even veterans felt the air grow colder. For the Americans, it was more than victory. It was transformation. The machine that had killed its own had become their protector. The beast had chosen its masters. As they prepared for the next battles, one truth echoed across every airfield. They laughed once. They will not laugh again. If you want to see how that laughter turned into terror, and how thunder began to rule the European sky, like this video, and stay with us. The story of power and fire has only just begun. By summer of 1943, the Americans had learned the hard way that fighting the Germans in turns and climbs was suicide. The Luftwaffe owned the tight maneuvers and sudden twists. But Major Hubert Zemke and his men discovered something the Germans didn't expect. Gravity itself could be a weapon. The Thunderbolt was heavy, but that weight carried power. When it dove, it didn't fall. It hunted. The pilots began calling it the Hammer of God. In training, Zemke made his men dive from 30,000 feet, over and over, until they learned to feel the rhythm of speed. The Jug screamed through the clouds at 500 miles per hour, the wind shaking the wings, the air turning solid around them. Other fighters lost control. The Thunderbolt did not. When it leveled out, the entire sky trembled. From that moment, the Americans understood. They didn't have to dance with their enemies anymore. They could strike from above, hit hard, and vanish before anyone could react. The Germans soon learned that chasing a diving Thunderbolt was hopeless. Once it dropped its nose, nothing could catch it. Pilots began using a new tactic called boom and zoom. Climb high, dive fast, strike once, then rise again before the enemy could even turn. It wasn't elegant, but it was deadly. Each attack came from the sun, sudden and unstoppable. German aces who once mocked the Americans now cursed them through gritted teeth. Captain Walker, Bud Mahurin, became one of the first to master the dive. He taught others to use speed like a sword, not a shield. "Don't turn with them," he said. "Don't fight their fight. Use your weight. Use your power." At 500 miles per hour, the Jug became a cannonball. The enemy's wings tore apart trying to follow. For the first time, the sky belonged to the Thunderbolt. Its roar wasn't just sound. It was a warning. The hammer was falling again. In the months that followed, Thunderbolts dominated the high altitudes. German pilots began avoiding the upper air, where the Americans waited like hawks. From 30,000 feet, the Jugs could choose when to fight and when to disappear. Their 8 Brownings created what pilots called the Wall of Lead, a deadly zone where metal became storm. Enemy aircraft caught in that crossfire didn't just fall, they disintegrated. From the ground, soldiers looked up and saw flashes like lightning moving across the blue. The roar of engines echoed like drums. The P-47 wasn't just a machine anymore. It was sound and fear and sky combined. German veterans who once called it a joke now whispered about its dives in the dark. The Americans had turned their heaviest fighter into the fastest killer. And the sound it made, that deep, endless thunder, would soon follow them all the way to Germany. August 1943. The missions grew deeper, the skies darker, and the air filled with a new kind of terror. When the P-47 opened fire, the sound was not a burst. It was a river. 8 Brownings spoke at once, pouring thousands of rounds every minute. To German pilots, it felt like flying into rain made of fire. Nothing in their training had prepared them for it. Each burst lasted only seconds. But in those seconds, the world dissolved. Aircraft broke apart mid-air, wings folding like paper. The convergence point, a circle no larger than a man, became death itself. The Thunderbolt did not need precision. It created probability. In that small circle of sky, survival was measured in inches. The Luftwaffe called it the American storm. They could dodge a shell, but not 6,000 bullets per minute. The Jug had found its true voice, and it was thunder. The new tactics changed everything. Now, the Thunderbolts didn't chase the enemy. They waited above the bombers, silent and invisible, until the time came to strike. German formations appeared below like shadows against the sun. One radio call, one dive, and the hammer fell. It wasn't a dogfight anymore. It was execution from the clouds. Each mission ended the same way, pieces of burning metal tumbling through the blue. Major Don Blakesley watched it happen and said quietly, "They laughed once." No one answered. The air was filled with drifting smoke and falling light. The sky belonged to the Americans now. The Thunderbolt had become more than a fighter. It was a judgment. But its story was not finished. As summer faded, new missions awaited. Missions not to defend, but to destroy. Ahead lay a firestorm that would cover all of Europe. August 17th, 1943. The sun rose quietly over England, but by noon the sky above Germany would be burning. Hundreds of bombers lifted from their runways, their silver wings flashing in the morning light. Behind and above them climbed the Thunderbolts. Their engines thundered across the clouds, forming a vast armor of sound around the bomber stream. The mission was to reach Schweinfurt and Regensburg, to strike deep into the heart of German industry. High above the earth, the air shimmered with heat and exhaust. The men inside their cockpits could see the curve of the world, the sun reflecting off endless glass and metal. It looked beautiful, until the first black bursts of flak appeared. One by one, the sky bloomed with fire. The pilots pressed their masks tighter, said nothing, and flew straight into it. In those moments, the war felt like a storm that could swallow the world. When the first wave reached Regensburg, the Luftwaffe was waiting. German fighters rose from every field, sharp, fast, deadly. From 28,000 feet, they looked like sparks rising toward a storm. Major David Schilling saw them first. "Here they come," he said quietly. Then he pushed his throttle forward and led his Thunderbolts into the dive. The air cracked, and the heavy fighters screamed downward. Below, German aces aimed for the bombers. But before they could fire, the sky erupted in tracer fire. The P-47s struck like falling stones. Every second was chaos, flashes of red, silver, and smoke spinning together. When it ended, 8 German fighters were gone. The others fled into cloud. Schilling pulled up through the haze, breathing hard. His fuel was low, his hands shaking. But he had seen something new that day. The power of the Thunderbolt unleashed at full speed. Every pilot who flew the Thunderbolt remembered its sound. It was not the scream of a single gun. It was the deep mechanical rhythm of 8. When they fired together, the whole aircraft shook. You could feel the vibration through your spine. The ammunition belts poured like rivers, cutting across the sky. For German pilots, meeting that wall of fire was like flying into lightning. The air itself seemed to explode. In one mission over France, a Luftwaffe ace described watching his wingman vanish. There was no hit, no fire, just a flash, and then nothing. That was the power of 8 Brownings converging at 300 yards. The Thunderbolt didn't need precision. It made the air deadly by volume alone. From the ground, soldiers said it looked like rain made of sparks. To the Americans above, it sounded like music, a terrible, perfect rhythm that no enemy could answer. By late 1943, the Thunderbolt had changed its mission. No longer just a guardian of bombers, it became a hunter. Rail lines, convoys, and airfields turned into targets. Pilots flew low, their shadows racing across the ground like dark birds. Each pass tore the landscape open, explosions rolling through villages and fields. The Germans called them Jabos, fighter bombers. The word spread terror wherever it was heard. Lieutenant Robert Johnson described the first low-level run. "You could smell the earth burning," he said. "You could see faces looking up before the fire came." The P-47 could carry bombs as heavy as a small bomber and still fight when attacked. It was no longer a question of survival. It was a question of endurance. Every mission left smoke behind, and every mile of road became a graveyard for machines. The Avalanche of Fire had reached the ground. Winter approached, but the missions did not stop. Thunderbolts now flew every day, covering bombers, destroying trains, crushing tanks. The Luftwaffe was losing altitude, losing fuel, losing hope. German pilots began calling the P-47 the butcher bird of the West. It was everywhere, over rivers, forests, and cities. Its thunder could be heard miles away, a sound that no one mistook for anything else. In December, reports told of entire divisions halted by a handful of Thunderbolts. Their guns tore through metal and armor like paper. The air smelled of smoke and oil. The ground shimmered from fire. Pilots landed at night with empty belts and shaking hands. They had become part of the storm they created. The sky no longer belonged to men. It belonged to machines. And as the year ended, a new question rose over Europe. If the air burns, what will happen to the Earth? By late 1943, the war in the sky had moved higher, above the clouds, where the air was thin and cold. Up there, men could see the curve of the Earth, the sunlight turning silver on their wings. The Thunderbolt ruled this frozen kingdom. Its massive, turbo-supercharged engine breathed where others gasped. At 30,000 feet, it still roared, while German fighters struggled to climb. From those heights, the world below looked peaceful. Fields, rivers, and towns hidden by mist. But in that quiet beauty, death waited. The pilots called it thin air, the place where sound disappeared, where the cold could kill faster than bullets. The Thunderbolt was built for it, armored against ice and emptiness. When it dived, the air itself screamed. This was not just altitude, it was dominance. The Americans had found a new home in the heavens, and the Germans could no longer follow. At 25,000 feet, engines began to fade. Oil thickened, controls froze, and breath turned to fog. The German pilots who once ruled the skies now fought against the air itself. Their light fighters shook and stalled. "The sky belongs to them now," one ace whispered before vanishing into cloud. The Thunderbolt could fly where the Luftwaffe could only dream. Its oxygen system kept the pilot alive, its power unbroken. American crews watched the altimeter climb beyond the limits of the enemy. They had entered a realm that felt almost sacred. The silence between radio calls stretched for miles. Then, through the quiet, came the first flashes. Thunderbolts diving from invisible heights. German formations shattered before they could react. The Americans had turned altitude into armor, and above 28,000 feet, the air no longer belonged to man. It belonged to the machine. October 8, 1943. The sky above Bremen turned white with flak smoke. German ace Hans Philipp, one of the most feared names in the Luftwaffe, led his Focke-Wulfs toward the bombers. He had survived Poland, France, and Russia. But this was different. His aircraft gasped for air at 28,000 feet. The engine coughed. The climb slowed. And then the Thunderbolts appeared. Robert Johnson spotted him through the glare of the sun. "He was good," Johnson said later, "but up there, the air belonged to us." The P-47 dove from above, guns flashing. The German ace vanished in seconds, swallowed by his own altitude. No parachute, no trace. When word reached German airfields, disbelief turned to silence. The Luftwaffe's best had fallen, not from lack of courage, but from lack of air. The higher they climbed, the more their power disappeared. By November, even German veterans felt it. The air itself had become their enemy. Reports told of pilots who refused to climb beyond 20,000 feet, who claimed their engines feared the cold. Above them, Thunderbolts waited, patient, invisible, untouchable. Every time the Germans rose, they met a storm of bullets and vanished in seconds. "It's like fighting ghosts," one survivor said. "They come out of the sun and disappear into heaven." For the Americans, the view from above was almost divine. The horizon curved softly. Clouds glowed like oceans of light. Yet beneath that beauty lay horror. Burning aircraft falling like meteors, trails of smoke marking the death of nations. The Thunderbolt was more than a weapon now. It was a presence, a sound that haunted the wind. The Germans called it Donnerschlag, thunderclap. Every roar above the clouds meant another loss below. By winter of 1943, the Thunderbolt had turned the sky into a kingdom of fear. German pilots no longer looked up, they listened. The deep roar from miles above meant death was coming. Some prayed before takeoff. Others sat silently, staring into the snow-covered fields. "The sky belongs to them," one officer wrote. "We live beneath their thunder." The airfields were quiet, the hangars cold, and the laughter gone. Meanwhile, the Americans prepared for something greater. The Thunderbolt had proven its strength, but new missions awaited, longer, deeper, deadlier. The time for defense was over. Ahead lay the invasion of Europe, where the P-47 would descend not just from altitude, but from history itself. If you want to follow this storm and see how thunder fell upon the earth, subscribe and stay with us. Because when the sky became silent, the fire began below. For months, the air above England had been alive with sound. Hundreds of Thunderbolts waited in their shelters, their wings marked with black and white stripes, the sign of what was coming. The pilots slept in their gear, listening to the wind outside, knowing that soon it would carry them over the sea. On June 6, 1944, they received the order. The time had come. At dawn, the engines began to roar. The mist lifted from the runways as the P-47s rolled into the air. Below them, ships filled the channel from horizon to horizon. It looked endless, a moving city made of steel. The sky turned orange as the first rays of sunlight touched the sea. "It felt like the world was holding its breath," one pilot said. And then we exhaled. The Thunderbolts headed for France, and the storm followed. The sea below boiled with movement. Thousands of ships, landing craft, and destroyers filled the gray water. Above them, the Thunderbolts flew low, their shadows crossing the waves. The beaches of Normandy were covered in smoke. Flashes of light cut through the haze. The radio came alive with voices, soldiers calling for air cover, tank commanders shouting coordinates, bombers requesting escort. The sky became a language of chaos. Captain Walker Mahurin led his flight toward Omaha Beach. "We could see them," he said later, men trapped behind walls of fire. The P-47s dove, dropping their bombs into the cliffs. The explosions shook the air. When they pulled up, the sand was alive with motion, men charging forward, waving, shouting. The pilots could feel it even through the roar. "We were their shield," one wrote. "Every bullet we fired kept them moving." By midday, the battle had moved inland. The beaches were behind them now, but the danger had not faded. German tanks rolled through the hedgerows, hidden under trees and camouflage. The Thunderbolts flew higher, circling in search of movement. When they saw it, they struck without warning. Rockets fell like rain, and the roads below turned into rivers of smoke. From the ground, soldiers watched in awe. "They came out of nowhere," one infantryman said. "The sky ripped open and the tanks disappeared." The P-47's guns tore through steel, setting fields ablaze. Even from miles away, the roar could be felt like thunder through the chest. The Germans called them Jabos, fighter bombers, but to the men below, they were angels of vengeance. Each pass was a message. The sky belonged to the Allies now. Not every flight came home. Anti-aircraft fire followed the Thunderbolts everywhere, black clouds of flak rising to meet them. Some pilots vanished in seconds, swallowed by smoke and flame. The sky was full of ghosts, one survivor said. "You flew through their echoes." The war above Normandy was as deadly as the one below. Every success came with a cost measured in names, not numbers. Yet they kept flying. Some landed with holes through their wings, oil spraying the cockpit. Others came back with nothing but silence on the radio. But they flew again the next morning, because the soldiers on the ground still needed them. "You didn't think about dying," one pilot said. "You thought about the men below." The Thunderbolt's courage matched its strength, heavy, loud, and unbreakable. When the sun finally set, the beaches were secure, but France was not free. The Thunderbolts landed on the temporary strips built behind the lines, their engines glowing in the dark. Mechanics worked through the night, rearming, refueling, repairing the scars of battle. The air smelled of oil and salt, and something else, victory, just beginning to take shape. The pilots knew that the war would not end here. Beyond Normandy lay Paris, then the Rhine, then Germany itself. The Thunderbolt would lead the way, blazing a path across a continent torn apart by fire. The men looked to the east, where lightning flashed in the clouds, and they smiled. Tomorrow they would fly again. The wings of Normandy had carried them forward, and soon thunder would fall on the heart of the Reich. By autumn of 1944, the war had changed. The Allies had broken through France and were pushing east toward the Rhine. Every day, the Thunderbolts led the way. They struck roads, bridges, trains, and factories. Everything that could move or burn. The Luftwaffe was fading, its airfields empty, its pilots exhausted. "We owned the daylight," one flyer said, "but the daylight owned us too." Each morning began with fog and ended with fire. Pilots flew 4, sometimes 5 missions a day, their faces dark with oil and sweat. The sound of the engine never left their ears, even in dreams. The war had become mechanical, a pattern of climb, dive, destroy, return. But behind that rhythm there was purpose. Every bridge destroyed meant fewer German tanks, fewer bullets, fewer deaths on the ground. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a weapon now. It was momentum, the wind of victory, pushing west to east. As the Thunderbolts crossed into Germany, the landscape changed. Gone were the open fields and beaches. Now the earth was dark, endless forests, rivers winding like veins through the land. German troops hid in the trees, their guns camouflaged beneath branches. From above, the forest looked still, but every shadow hid danger. Pilots flew lower than ever before, chasing smoke through the valleys. Lieutenant Frank Euler led one of the low-level strikes. "You could feel the trees brushing the wings," he said. "Every second felt like a lifetime." The flak was thick, rising like black flowers from the woods. The thunderbolts weaved through it, firing rockets and cannons until the hills glowed red. Below, entire convoys vanished under fire. The air smelled of pine and smoke. The men who survived that day said it felt like flying through the heart of the earth, where even angels would fear to go. By November, there were fewer dogfights. The Luftwaffe still flew, but their numbers were shadows of what they had been. The sky felt empty now, quiet, but not peaceful. "You could feel the ghosts," one pilot said. Every cloud held a memory. The Americans no longer fought for survival. They fought to finish what had begun years before. Every mission felt heavier, slower, like the world was tired of war. At 30,000 feet, thunderbolts flew above a sleeping enemy. Cities burned below them, red lights flickering through smoke. The pilots didn't cheer when they hit their targets. They simply turned for home, thinking of the faces they'd never see again. "The war changes you," another pilot said. "You stop asking why, you just fly." The silence after each mission grew longer and colder. Victory was close. But so was the end of something human. By December, the Rhine lay ahead, the last great barrier before the heart of Germany. Bridges burned in the distance, their metal frames twisted by bombs. The air was thick with frost and smoke. Pilots said it smelled like iron. They flew missions from dawn until dusk, tracing the river like a line drawn by fate. Every bridge destroyed brought the war closer to its end, and yet it felt endless. The German soldiers below fired everything they had, rifles, flak, even desperation. The sky turned black with smoke, but the thunderbolts pressed on. One squadron lost half its number in a single day, and still returned the next morning. "We had no choice," a pilot said. "If we stopped, the war would keep going forever." The Rhine became more than a river. It was a scar dividing two worlds. On one side stood exhaustion, on the other, redemption. By early 1945, the sky was theirs. The thunderbolts flew over a dying empire, towns reduced to ashes, roads filled with wreckage. But even in victory, there was no joy. "We didn't feel like heroes," one pilot said. "We just wanted it to stop." Each mission carried the same rhythm: climb, dive, fire, return. But now the targets were closer to Berlin. The heart of the Reich was within reach. As they prepared for the final push, the men grew quiet. They had seen the power of thunder and its cost. The roar that once meant victory now echoed like grief. Yet they flew again because history demanded it. Soon they would see the end, not just of the war, but of everything they had become. If you've followed their journey this far, comment below what moment struck you most, and stay with us. The thunder is approaching Berlin, and the storm will end where it began, in fire. By February 1945, the skies over Europe had turned gray again. Snow covered the fields below, muffling the echoes of war. The thunderbolts still flew, but fewer now, their missions shorter, their targets rarer. The enemy was collapsing, piece by piece. It felt strange, one pilot said, like flying through the end of the world. From high above, the land looked lifeless. Smoke no longer rose from cities, only steam from frozen rivers. The radio channels were quiet. No chatter, no laughter. The men flew their patrols in silence, listening to the hum of engines and the wind. It was peaceful, another recalled, but the kind of peace that scares you. The war was ending, and yet no one felt safe. The sky that once thundered with power now whispered like a memory fading away. March brought the final orders. The Thunderbolts were to strike retreating German columns near the Elbe. It sounded simple, but nothing about the last days of war was easy. The weather was cold and wet. The airfields turned to mud. Mechanics worked by lantern light, patching bullet holes and cleaning frozen guns. "We were all running on habit," said one crew chief. "The war was ending, but we couldn't stop moving." The mission went as planned. Tanks destroyed, bridges gone, roads silent. But as the planes turned home, a burst of flak hit one Thunderbolt. It spiraled down through the mist. The pilot's name was never forgotten. When they landed, no one spoke. They just looked at the empty space where his aircraft should have been. "We'd made it this far," a pilot said softly. And still, the sky took one more. The thunder that once roared now fell quiet. When victory finally came, it was not with cheers, but with silence. The guns stopped. The radios went still. Pilots sat in their cockpits long after landing, staring at the ground. "We didn't know what to feel," one man said. "We were alive, but part of us wasn't." The airfields that once echoed with engines now hummed with nothing but wind. The Thunderbolts stood in rows, their metal skins streaked with oil and rain. Some bore names written by hand, symbols of friends lost. The men walked among them like mourners in a graveyard of machines. "They carried us," a pilot whispered, "and we carried their ghosts." The war was over, but the thunder still lingered, deep in their bones. In the months after the war, the Thunderbolts were sent home. Some were scrapped, others stood forgotten in fields. The men who flew them tried to return to normal life, but the sound of the engine never left. It followed them into sleep, a soft hum, a vibration in the dark. "Sometimes," one said, "I wake up and swear I still hear it climbing." The war had given them wings, and taken something in return. Museums would one day tell their story, and people would stand before those massive wings, wondering how such machines ever flew. But only those who had lived it could understand. "We didn't just fly through war," a veteran said. "We became part of it." The Thunderbolt was more than a fighter. It was a witness. And when its engines stopped, part of history fell silent with it. Years later, when the veterans spoke, their voices carried that same rhythm. Slow, calm, like engines idling far away. They remembered the sound more than anything, the roar that filled the world and then vanished. "It wasn't the killing," one said. "It was the sky, the way it felt when we ruled it." Others simply nodded. Some stories didn't need words. The Thunderbolt had fallen silent, but its echo remained, in museums, in skies, in memory. Its thunder had changed the world, and the men who flew it. If this story moved you, share it, so that others may hear the sound of history before it fades. Because every echo begins with a voice, and every storm begins with a single spark. The thunder may have fallen, but its echo still rolls through time. When the thunder faded, the world exhaled. Cities began to rise from ashes, fields turned green again, and the silence that followed war became its own kind of peace. But the sound of the thunderbolt never truly disappeared. It lingered in the air, in stories told by old men to their children, in the echoes of engines that once shook the clouds. The sky, once a battlefield, was calm again. Those who survived spoke not of victory, but of endurance. "We didn't win the war alone," one said, "but we carried its weight through the air." The thunderbolt was more than metal. It was willpower shaped into flight. And when the world looked up again, it remembered the sound that meant hope. Above the ruins of Europe, the clouds slowly closed, and the echoes of war turned into whispers of memory. Years passed, and the world changed. New aircraft took to the skies, faster, sleeker, louder. But the Thunderbolt remained, in museums, in old photographs, in the hearts of those who had seen it fly. "It looked heavy," one child said, staring at it behind glass. "How did it ever lift?" The answer was simple: will. It lifted because men believed it could. At air shows, the veterans gathered, standing side by side, their eyes following the distant sound of engines. Some smiled, others cried quietly. "That's her," they whispered, as a restored Thunderbolt roared above. The crowd looked up in awe, but for those men, it was something else, a reunion. For a moment, time folded, and they were young again. The echo of thunder had found its home in memory. There are places where the past never leaves, fields where the grass still hides twisted metal, forests where silence feels heavy. Pilots say that sometimes in the right wind you can still hear the faint hum of engines far above. The sky remembers. Every gust, every cloud, every dawn carries a fragment of what once was. The Thunderbolt is gone, but the air that held it still tells its story. In the villages once marked by fire, children play again. The world healed slowly, not by forgetting, but by remembering with gentleness. "Peace," a veteran once said, "is not silence. It's the echo after the noise." And so the sky remains, vast, forgiving, eternal. The same canvas where men once fought now holds only birds and light. Yet deep inside the wind, the thunder sleeps. The story of the Thunderbolt is not about war. It's about courage, endurance, and the sky itself. Its thunder carried the hope of millions and reminded the world that even in darkness, light can rise again. The men who flew it grew old, but their voices still echo through history. Each word, each memory keeps the engine alive, one heartbeat at a time. And now, the legacy continues with us. Every time you look at the sky, remember those who turned storms into freedom. Their thunder built the world we live in. If their story inspired you, subscribe and stay with us. Because every end is just the beginning of another flight. The sky remains, waiting, timeless, eternal. The thunder sleeps, but never dies.